The rising sun painted the Texas horizon in slow strokes of amber and ochre, pushing back the shadows that clung to the low hills and the weathered fence lines of the road's property. The air was dry, quiet, and already beginning to warm as dust kicked up gently around the worn boots of Lucas Rhodes. He'd been up before dawn, as he was every day, walking the perimeter of the property, counting heads, checking gates, and watching the behavior of the animals. His bull, Roy, an aging but still formidable Hereford cross, stood near the south pasture gate, snorting gently at the breeze. Roy was more than livestock. He was a warning, a presence, and in recent years, a partner in silence. Lucas had lived on this land his entire life. His father had bought it when the region was barely electrified, carving a life out of dirt and stubbornness. Lucas inherited the ranch after a decade of co-managing it with his brother, who had passed away the previous year. He had no children, no siblings left, and no interest in giving up the only thing he'd ever trusted. The land didn't lie. It didn't manipulate or overreach. When it turned against you, it did so in the open and without shame. That was more than he could say about people these days. He'd never been one for dramatics or sentimentality. People talked a lot about legacy and bloodlines and what they hoped to leave behind. Lucas believed in simpler truths: a good fence, clean water, and the dignity of solitude. His home, a low, practical ranch-style house with a tin roof and hand-cut cedar beams, sat roughly in the center of the property, hidden behind a slope and shielded by oak trees whose branches tangled like the arms of old men. The mailbox bore no name, only a number, and the gravel road to the main gate was flanked by barbed wire fencing with warning signs posted at even intervals. Private property. Do not enter. Trespassers will be prosecuted. The signs weren't for show. They were there because people had forgotten how to recognize a boundary unless it shouted at them. And Lucas didn't shout. He believed that respect should be understood without explanation. But in the last few months, something had shifted. A feeling, quiet, slow, but persistent, had begun to unsettle him. He noticed it first in the details. A shift in the weight of the gate when it opened. A new scratch on the metal hinge. A pair of tire tracks in the southern pasture that didn't match anything in his stable. The kind of things that could be brushed off as coincidence or animal activity. But Lucas didn't believe in coincidence, and he knew how his land moved. When something was off, it whispered to him like an old friend with bad news. One morning, while tightening the hinges on the east gate, he found something that made him pause. A small, neon-colored plastic ribbon tied around a post, the kind used by construction surveyors or developers. It wasn't from him. He hadn't had any work done on the fencing since the spring rains had ended. He cut it off and pocketed it without a word. A few days later, another ribbon appeared, this time closer to the water trough. Then a fresh boot print, cleaner than his own, appeared near the windmill pump, deep in the clay, too sharp and recent to ignore. Lucas didn't panic, and he didn't call the sheriff. He simply walked back to the house, fed Roy his midday ration, and sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee. His hands, though rough and thick-knuckled from decades of rope and steel, were steady. He stared out at the road. Nothing came. Nothing moved, but he stayed there for hours, watching, listening. The silence of the land was not a lack of sound, it was the presence of order. When that silence was broken, even if no ear could catch the noise, the body knew. That evening, he walked the perimeter again, slower this time, tracing the outer trail that circled the full breadth of his property. It took over an hour. The sky had darkened to a soft navy by the time he reached the southern boundary, the one nearest to the county road. There, he found a small pile of fresh cigarette butts near the fence post. New, still holding scent, crushed deliberately into the dirt. Someone had stood there, watched, waited. Lucas didn't call the sheriff then either. He didn't want a report. He wanted clarity, and law enforcement rarely brought that anymore. Instead, he returned to the house, unlocked the old gun safe in the back room, and took out the 12-gauge shotgun that hadn't seen use in over a year. He didn't load it. He didn't need to. The act of carrying it was enough, for now. The next morning, everything was still. For 2 weeks, no signs appeared, no tracks, no ribbons. Lucas almost convinced himself that whoever it was had moved on. Then, while checking the south trough, he found the latch on the pasture gate unhooked. It wasn't broken. It wasn't forced. It had simply been opened, calmly, smoothly, and left that way. Roy hadn't wandered, but he'd been visibly agitated, circling the fence line more than usual. Lucas closed the latch, checked the trail cams, and found one had been moved. Its mount twisted slightly upward to face the tree canopy. That night, he sat again on the porch with a thermos of coffee and Roy grazing in the field below. He kept the porch light off. It was a new moon. Darkness draped the land like a blanket. Nothing happened. But Lucas didn't sleep. At dawn, he saddled up his quad and did a slow sweep of the land, just to feel the air and listen to the birds. By then, he wasn't wondering if someone was trespassing. He was waiting for the moment they stopped hiding, and that moment came sooner than he expected. 3 days later, as he came back from town with a new hydraulic coupling for the hay baler, Lucas turned onto his private road and saw something that stopped his truck cold. Halfway up the path, on his side of the gate, sat a black SUV, clean, idle, and out of place. And beside it, standing on his gravel, was a woman in a designer jacket and oversized sunglasses, clipboard in hand, and 4 people wandering casually toward the barn like it was a petting zoo. No permission, no call, no notice. They weren't just on his land. They were acting like they owned it. And that was the last mistake they'd make that day. Lucas didn't slam the brakes or storm out of the truck. That wasn't his way. Instead, he slowed the vehicle, turned off the ignition, and let the dust settle around him as he sat there, eyes narrowed behind the cracked windshield, watching the intruders as if observing a pack of coyotes sniffing at a chicken coop. His hands didn't tremble, though his jaw tensed slightly. The woman standing by the SUV didn't notice him right away. She was too busy gesturing toward the barn with exaggerated enthusiasm, clipboard waving in her hand like some overgrown baton. The others were spread out. 2 couples, mid-30s maybe, dressed in pastel athletic wear, city-polished, their movements casual and loud against the stillness of the ranch. They were pointing at things, taking pictures with their phones, and one of the men had the audacity to lean against the side of Lucas's old hay cart as if it were some rustic photo prop. He stepped out of the truck without saying a word. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he made his way toward them, not rushing, not yelling, just walking with the kind of deliberate calm that usually preceded a storm. The woman finally noticed him and turned with a smile too wide to be genuine. She was a large woman, not fat exactly, but heavy in a way that took up space and expected the world to move around her. Her blonde hair was piled into a styled nest that looked better suited for a country club luncheon than a ranch, and her perfume reached Lucas 5 steps before her voice did. "Oh, there you are," she called out brightly as though they'd had an appointment. "You must be Mr. Rhodes. I'm Karen Shaw, licensed broker with Sterling Range Realty. We're just—" "You're trespassing," Lucas said, his voice low but clear. Karen blinked, caught off guard by the interruption. She recovered quickly, though, flashing her credentials like a badge. "There must be some misunderstanding. We had every reason to believe this land was open for viewing. It's listed in the Provisional Regional Parcel Access file. It's perfectly legal to assess an unclaimed agricultural holding when this land is claimed," Lucas interrupted again, unmoved by the jargon. "It's mine. You're standing on private property. The gate was closed for a reason. You cut the lock?" Karen paused, lips parting slightly before smoothing her blouse down with one hand. Well, the lock was rusted, and there was no signage on the gate itself, just farther down the fence line. I assumed— "You don't assume on someone else's land," Lucas said, taking another step forward, close enough now that the clipboard wobbled in her hand. "You ask. You call. You knock. You don't bring a damn parade in here and start poking around like it's a Sunday market." Behind Karen, one of the women called out, "Babe, come look at this old barn. It's totally authentic." Karen didn't turn, but Lucas did. His voice dropped into something colder. "Get away from the barn." The group hesitated. The tone left no room for interpretation. Lucas turned back to Karen. "I've had enough of this. You've got 2 minutes to get off my land." Karen lifted her chin. "Mr. Rhodes, there's no need for hostility. We're prepared to make a competitive offer if the terms are right. Sterling Range specializes in heritage conversions, eco-lodges, glamping retreats, boutique vineyard estates. This property has extraordinary potential, and we have clients who— "You ever hear of a bull named Roy?" Lucas asked, ignoring her entirely. Karen blinked. "What?" Lucas looked past her toward the far pasture gate where the fencing was old but sturdy. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black remote. One click. The light on the southern fence line went out. Another click. The gate unlatched with a clank, swinging open slowly. A moment later, Roy appeared. The Hereford crossbull was broad and sun-darkened, his chest like a battering ram, his horns thick and uneven. He didn't charge. He didn't need to. His pace was steady and purposeful, his snorting breaths visible even in the late morning heat. The clients froze. One of the men actually dropped his phone, backing up toward the SUV. Karen stepped back, unsure if this was a joke or some sort of stunt. "Mr. Rhodes, what are you doing?" Lucas didn't answer. He simply stood there, calm and silent as Roy approached the edge of the gravel loop. The bull wasn't angry. Not yet, but his presence alone was a message, one that didn't require words. "Babe, get in the car. Get in the car now," one of the clients shouted. Within seconds, the two couples were scrambling, one woman in heels tripping over a rock and yelping as she hobbled toward the SUV. Karen, to her credit, stood her ground for another 10 seconds before Roy let out a low, guttural grunt and took 2 heavier steps forward. Then she moved. The SUV doors slammed. The engine roared to life. Karen stood with one hand on the doorframe, glaring at Lucas through her designer sunglasses. "You'll regret this," she said, voice shaking just enough to betray her anger. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Lucas stared back. "And you have no idea whose land you just walked on." She climbed in. The vehicle reversed fast, kicking up gravel and leaving a cloud of dust behind as it sped down the private road and disappeared beyond the gate line. Lucas stood still for a while, watching the dust settle. Roy wandered to the edge of the drive, sniffed at the ground, then meandered back toward the pasture with the indifference of a creature unimpressed by human drama. Lucas clicked the gate shut and rearmed the fence. The electricity hummed faintly in the wire as he walked back toward the house, passing by the crushed cigarette butts, the still-warm tire tracks, and a broken coffee cup someone had dropped in the panic. He picked up the cup, turned it over once in his hand, then dropped it into the burn barrel near the barn. As he stood there, his eyes scanned the horizon. The land had gone quiet again. But it was not peace. It was the calm before the real fight. The next few days passed without incident, but Lucas Rhodes knew better than to think the matter had ended. Men who'd spent their lives on land like his didn't take silence as resolution. They took it as regrouping. He checked the southern fence line every morning and evening, tested the electric charge manually, re-inspected the trail cameras, and walked the perimeter on foot instead of relying on his ATV. He didn't mention the incident to anyone, Not the old mechanic down at Lenny's Auto who always asked about the ranch. Not the woman at the feed store who liked to share gossip between weighing hay bales. Lucas knew the moment he started talking, someone else would start listening, and for now, he preferred to listen alone. It was on the fourth morning, during his 5:00 a.m. walk, that he noticed the change. A new padlock had been installed on the north utility gate. Not broken, not his. It was heavy-duty, matte black, unbranded. Not the kind you find at the local hardware store, the kind you special order in bulk. Someone had come back, not to vandalize, not to steal, but to claim, quietly, with steel and confidence. Lucas walked back to the barn, opened his equipment cabinet, and retrieved his bolt cutters. It took one clean squeeze. The lock fell to the ground with a satisfying clunk, and he dropped it into an empty feed bucket like a dead snake. He didn't curse, didn't mutter. He just replaced the gate's latch with his own hardware and tightened it with a wrench, twisting until his palm ached. Later that day, he drove into town and stopped by the county registrar's office. The woman behind the desk greeted him warmly. She'd known his brother, even dated him back in high school. Lucas asked for a parcel status check on his land. Routine, he said. She raised an eyebrow but obliged. 10 minutes later, she returned with a puzzled look. "Well," she said, "you're still listed as the sole owner, of course, but there's a new provisional tag on the adjacent metadata, something about planned environmental review access. That doesn't affect your deed, just the planning map overlays." Lucas didn't respond. She showed him the screen. Sure enough, a rectangular sliver of his southern pasture was highlighted in a pale yellow, a planning layer. It had been pulled in as part of a broader assessment survey for development potential. That meant some company had requested access to assess infrastructure feasibility. It didn't give them permission to build, but it gave them presence. And presence, Lucas knew, was how these things started. He left with a printed copy of the file and drove straight to his lawyer's office on the west side of town. Mary Stein was competent, discreet, and not the kind of woman who panicked. After reading the paperwork and listening to Lucas's brief explanation, she leaned back in her chair and said, "They're testing you, trying to see how much you'll tolerate before you make noise. This kind of survey overlay doesn't happen by accident. Someone's trying to establish a footprint." "What's my play?" Lucas asked, hands resting calmly on his knees. "You file a property usage injunction," she said. "You go on record opposing all access. No exceptions. We'll do it before the next business cycle closes, so if someone's trying to fast-track a purchase file, they'll hit a wall. But you need to be ready for pushback." Lucas nodded once. That night, when he returned home, there was a small pile of gravel just inside the gate, about half a shovel's worth. Fresh, light gray, the kind used in commercial lot leveling, not the coarse stuff from his own driveway. It wasn't much, just enough to notice, enough to say, "We've been here again." The next morning, he installed a second trail cam near the eastern tree line, camouflaged inside a rusted old birdhouse. It had better night resolution and was positioned to catch movement approaching from the road. After that, he spent the day doing real work, checking fence posts, treating a sick calf, patching a leak in the water line near the feed trough. He needed to keep the rhythm of the ranch steady. That was how he thought best. Through labor, not worry. But the rhythm broke again at dusk. As he came back up the hill toward the house, he saw it. A drone, low, quiet, maybe 50 feet above ground, drifting lazily over his barn like a mosquito looking for soft skin. It didn't have a brand mark or registration label, just a blinking red diode and a camera mount. Lucas didn't waste time. He walked into the barn, retrieved his old Remington 22, and fired one clean shot. The drone stuttered, tipped, and spiraled into the dirt like a wounded bird. He buried it beneath a tire pile. If anyone came looking, they'd find nothing but dust and rubber. The next day, Karen Shaw returned. This time she came alone, in a different vehicle. A white sedan with tinted windows and a temporary plate. Lucas saw her coming from the porch and didn't move. She parked right in front of the main gate and stepped out, her heels sticking awkwardly in the gravel. She wore dark glasses again, but this time no smile. She held a manila envelope in her left hand. "I'm here as a courtesy," she said, raising her voice just enough to carry. "You'll be getting a letter of inquiry from a holding group within the next few days. I'd suggest you read it carefully. There's a considerable sum being prepared for your consideration." Lucas didn't speak. Karen took a slow step forward, testing his stillness. "You may not want to sell, I get it. But things are happening whether you sign or not. The overlay approvals are public. There's political support. You're one ranch in the middle of a consolidation zone. You're not the future here." Still, he said nothing. She extended the envelope through the bars of the gate, then let it drop when he didn't approach. "I'm not your enemy, Mr. Rhodes," she said, her voice lower now. "I'm just trying to help you make the smart choice before this gets ugly." Then she got back into the car and drove away. Lucas didn't pick up the envelope. He waited until nightfall, then burned it in the same barrel where he'd tossed the broken coffee cup. He watched the paper curl and blacken, the edges glowing like fire ants, until it was gone. The next morning, he found the southern gate unlatched again. This time, there were no tracks. Only the silence, and the slow, steady sound of Roy's hooves grinding into the dirt, waiting for what came next. Lucas didn't sleep that night. He lay on the worn leather couch in his living room, fully clothed, boots still on, shotgun leaning against the wall beside him, and the faint hum of the electric fence monitor ticking softly in the background. Outside, the land was quiet but not still. Wind stirred the trees, and somewhere far off a fox barked into the dark. He didn't believe in premonitions or instinctual sixth senses, but he'd lived enough life to recognize that the body knows before the mind accepts. Something was changing. Something had already changed. The morning came without rest, and Lucas rose stiffly, poured black coffee into an old thermos, and walked the property as he always did. The gates were all closed this time, but the latch on the east gate hung at an odd angle, as if someone had closed it too hard or too fast. A trail of disturbed soil led away from the fence toward the tree line, and in the half-light he saw an impression in the grass, about the size of a boot sole, but only one, angled sideways. Whoever had stepped there hadn't wanted to leave a path, but they had. By mid-morning, he was back in town, not at the registrar's office or the lawyer's, but at the feed store. Not to buy anything, just to be seen. He lingered longer than usual near the bulletin board, nodding to the two ranchers arguing over grain prices and weather patterns. He asked about fencing prices even though he didn't need any. He made sure that when he left, everyone saw him leaving. Visibility had power, and he knew that in a town like this, silence could draw attention faster than words. When he got home, a white pickup truck was parked just off the road near his south fence. Unmarked, no plates, windows rolled down. No one inside. No footprints leading from the truck. He stood by the fence and watched it for a full minute, then walked back to the barn, opened the rear panel of the breaker box, and shut off power to the lower fields. The fence line went cold. If someone was watching, they'd assume he was out of the house. He waited. 15 minutes passed before a man stepped out from behind the tree line. Young, clean-cut, collared shirt, a phone in his hand, and a notepad in the other. Not from the town. Not even from the county. Lucas didn't move. He didn't greet him. He simply stepped out from the barn, shotgun held low but visible, and walked slowly toward the fence. The man froze. His hand twitched toward his pocket, then thought better of it. He turned and walked back to the truck without a word, climbed in, and drove off without even looking back. Lucas stood at the fence long after the dust settled. That evening, Mary Stein called. The injunction had been processed and acknowledged. No access to the property would be considered lawful, survey or otherwise, until reviewed through formal channels. Lucas thanked her and said nothing more. He knew it wouldn't stop them. The next day, a letter arrived by courier. No stamp, no return address, just a printed envelope with his name in block letters. Inside was a 2-page form, signed and notarized, indicating an intent to inspect, issued by a private environmental contractor, along with a generic map of the region showing the southern corner of his ranch marked as ecologically sensitive. He laughed, the first real laugh in days. Sensitive. His land had been drought-scorched, fire-hardened, and flood-tested for 3 generations. But now, suddenly, it needed reviewing. He placed the document back in the envelope and left it on the front gate post, where the wind took it by morning. 3 nights later, Roy began pacing the fence near the eastern trail. Lucas watched him from the porch. The bull wasn't agitated without reason. Lucas walked the trail just before midnight and found the remnants of a meal, plastic packaging from a high-end protein bar, a disposable spoon, and a crushed water bottle shoved under a bush. Someone had been watching again. Not kids, not squatters, professionals who didn't want to leave trash but had gotten sloppy, or too comfortable. That was a mistake. The next day, Lucas took down 2 of his visible trail cams and replaced them with 3 concealed ones. 2 in hollow posts, 1 embedded in the vented casing of an old irrigation pump. He rewired the power grid so that cutting the fence would kill the lights on the western shed, a subtle but clear signal only he would notice. What followed was 5 days of nothing. Clear skies. No strange vehicles. Roy, calm. The gates untouched. Lucas didn't relax. He sharpened his tools, greased his hinges, recoiled barbed wire. At night he slept with one eye open and a map of his own land laid out on the kitchen table, marked with red pen wherever recent signs had appeared. Then, on the 6th day, just before sunrise, he found his mailbox hanging from one hinge, split open as if someone had tried to pry something out, or stuff something in. Inside was a note. Plain printer paper, typed, "This isn't personal. You're holding up progress." Lucas stared at the note for a long time before lighting a match and watching it curl into black. That afternoon, he drove to the sheriff's office. Not to report a crime, just to sit on the bench outside and nod at the deputies as they came and went. On the way back, he stopped at the diner and ordered coffee to go. When asked how he was, he said, "Can't complain." Then he drove home, unloaded 3 bags of feed, fixed a loose bracket on the shed door, and sat on the porch with Roy watching the sun go down. The air was heavy with dust and dry grass, and the wind carried nothing but the sound of cicadas. But Lucas could feel it. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here. 2 nights after the mailbox incident, Lucas was woken not by noise, but by silence. An absence so sharp it felt like pressure in his ears. The cicadas had stopped. The frogs along the backwater weren't croaking, and the night air felt too still, too dense, like something had settled over the land and refused to move. He sat up, boots already by the couch, shotgun in reach. No alarms had gone off, no motion sensors. But Lucas had long stopped trusting electronics to catch what a man's gut already knew. He stepped outside, letting the screen door click quietly behind him, and scanned the tree line. Roy stood stiffly near the fence, head lowered, ears twitching toward the south pasture. Lucas didn't wait. He walked the trail in near dark, no flashlight, just the pale wash of starlight overhead, moving with a quiet efficiency that came from decades of navigating his own land in all seasons. When he reached the south gate, he stopped. There were 3 fresh tire tracks. Not parallel, not from someone leaving, but from someone turning around fast. A sharp V of movement kicked gravel and a faint chemical scent in the air. He crouched, running his fingers over the still warm rubber dust, then looked up and saw the thing that made his stomach harden. A set of plastic corner flags. Survey markers, the kind used in construction mapping, had been hammered into the outer. Fence posts, 6 of them. Bright orange, reflective tape, less than 12 feet from where Roy usually grazed at sunrise. By noon the next day, Lucas was in his lawyer's office again, and this time he wasn't calm. Mary Stein listened without interruption, then picked up her landline and called someone directly at the assessor's bureau. 10 minutes later, she hung up and turned to Lucas with a look that told him everything he needed to know. They're fast-tracking the zoning overlay. Someone filed a concurrent application claiming there's ambiguity in your southern border. They're leveraging that old transfer from your brother's estate, saying the records didn't properly update. Lucas didn't move, but his jaw clenched. They're saying what now? Mary tapped her pen on the desk. It's a technicality, but they're using it to request temporary developmental access pending resolution. It's shady, but not illegal unless we can prove deliberate fraud. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply stood, nodded once, and walked out. That night, he did what he hadn't done in years. He called in a favor. A former field inspector, long since retired, someone Lucas had once helped bury a bad zoning decision 20 years ago. No names were exchanged over the phone, just a place and a time. The next morning, a man in an old Bronco pulled up the gravel drive and stepped out without speaking. He looked at the flags, then at the land, then at Lucas. This isn't mapping. This is anchoring. They're prepping to fence. Lucas nodded. I figured. The man walked the length of the markers, made a few notes on a folded-up notepad, and handed it to Lucas. You didn't get this from me, but they're dirty. They've tried this out west near Cibolo Creek. They get a sympathetic contractor to accidentally start building, then offer to buy the land outright to avoid legal mess. People settle because court costs too much. You hold firm, you make them bleed ink, they back off. Lucas didn't waste time. That afternoon, he moved Roy and the rest of the livestock into the upper pastures, then used his old tilling equipment to trench a 10-foot strip just inside the southern perimeter. He didn't install anything, just tore up the soil deep enough that any truck trying to cross would sink. Then he pulled the burned drone from the tire pile, wrapped it in cloth, and mailed it without return address to the Sterling Range Realty office. Let them chew on that. The following day, Karen came back. This time, she brought company. A man in a crisp white shirt and dusty cowboy boots, clearly chosen for image, not function, stood beside her, arms folded, looking over the land like he was already counting parcels. Karen didn't get out. She stayed in the car with the engine running. The man approached the gate slowly, like he was walking through someone else's living room. Lucas stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching. I'm not here to threaten you, Mr. Rhodes, the man called out in a voice tuned for courtrooms. Just want to talk. Lucas didn't move. I represent an entity with significant interest in this region. We've acquired all but 4 properties within the environmental corridor. Yours is one. You're not being targeted. You're just last. Lucas stepped down from the porch. Then you should have started with me. The man smiled, professional and toothless. No hard feelings. But you should know, any interference with contractors could result in civil penalties. We've filed paperwork. Things are in motion. You set 1 foot past that gate, Lucas said, and you'll be in motion. The man didn't answer. He turned and walked back to the car. Karen didn't even look out the window as they drove off. That night, Lucas found his wellhead tampered with. Not sabotaged, just loosened enough to cause a pressure drop. Subtle. Annoying. A message. He didn't bother fixing it right away. Instead, he placed a motion alarm just inside the access panel, wired to a silent alert in the barn. Then he took the old 30-30 from the gun rack and cleaned it for the first time in a year. He wasn't preparing for violence. He was preparing for clarity. The next morning, at 3:14 a.m., the alert buzzed once. Lucas was already halfway to the well by the time the figure crouched near the casing froze under the sudden beam of a high-lumen spotlight. No mask, no badge, just a man in utility clothes with a wrench in one hand and a phone in the other. "You're trespassing," Lucas said. "Walk." The man did. The following morning, a cease and desist letter was nailed to Lucas's gate. Not mailed, not handed over. Nailed. Like a warning. It accused him of obstruction, unlawful interference, and intimidation of contractors operating under lawful pretense. No signature, no letterhead, just type. Lucas tore it down and fed it to the same burn barrel as the rest. 3 days later, the county assessor's office received 30 notarized statements from local ranchers, none orchestrated by Lucas, attesting to similar pressure tactics, intimidation, and false filings. Someone else had started talking. Karen didn't return. The white-shirted man didn't return, but the flag stayed, and that was enough. Lucas sat on the porch that night, Roy nearby, the wind carrying dust off the fields. He didn't speak. He didn't plan. He waited, because now he knew. They weren't going to back off. They were going to escalate. But so was he. It wasn't a shot that woke Lucas. It wasn't a scream or a siren or the crackle of fire. It was the vibration, a low, rhythmic tremor that traveled through the dry boards of the porch floor and into his boots, still beside the old chair where he'd nodded off. He stood quickly, pulled his jacket around him, and stepped into the cold night air. In the distance, just past the southern pasture, 2 white lights hovered low over the dirt like hungry eyes. Headlights, slowly crawling. He didn't panic. He didn't shout. He turned toward the barn, where Roy's breath steamed in the moonlight and the fence lines glowed faintly under the infrared floodlights. It was nearly 3:30 a.m. Lucas reached the shed, unlocked the toolbox, and retrieved the flare gun. Not to use it, but to hold it. Something silent, something visible, something a trespasser could understand even before words. By the time he reached the ridge, he saw what was coming. 3 ATVs, moving in parallel across the lowest tier of the southern pasture, cutting across the freshly tilled strip as if it were nothing more than a worn-out trail. No markings, no uniforms, but professional. They moved with the purpose of people who believed they wouldn't be stopped. That belief ended when Roy appeared. The bull didn't charge, not immediately. He emerged from the dark like a shape cut from the dirt itself, broad and patient, his body still except for the steady swing of his tail and the slight dip of his head. He placed himself between the barn and the riders and made no effort to move aside. One of them revved the engine. Another waved an arm. Lucas raised the flare gun. The red shell popped into the sky and lit the land in blood for a moment, long enough for every man on those machines to see they were exposed, outnumbered not by people, but by resolve. Roy stepped forward once, just enough for his hoof to thud against packed dirt. That was enough. The first rider turned, then the second. The third hesitated. Maybe pride, maybe orders, but a second later, he too turned. They retreated without speed, without panic, but not without shame. Lucas watched them disappear into the tree line, then returned to the barn, rearmed the fence circuit, and stood beside Roy, running a hand along the bull's flank as the sky began to turn. At 7 a.m., he drove into town. By 9:08 a.m., the sheriff had received his first formal trespassing complaint in nearly 6 years. Not a request for protection, not a plea, just a documented assertion that any further unauthorized entry onto the road's property would result in a full civil response and legal counteraction, with supporting footage, timestamps, and physical evidence. By noon, Mary Stein had served copies of the filing to the registrar, the development board, and the Office of Public Lands. The message was clear: no more patience, no more silence. That afternoon, a courier arrived at the ranch. Not a uniformed driver or a local clerk. A private service. Plain van, plain clothes. He handed Lucas a thick envelope and said, "I was told to deliver this directly. No sign-off needed." Lucas opened it after the man left. Inside was a letter. Real paper, real letterhead, and a release form. A buyout. Final. With a dollar figure that made the corners of his eyes twitch. Not from interest, but from insult. They weren't offering him a future. They were offering him silence. The letter was signed not by Karen Shaw, not by the white-shirted man, but by someone else entirely. A corporate name, hidden behind layers of holding groups and legal insulation. The game had moved upstairs. Lucas didn't respond. He didn't burn the letter. He kept it. Not as a trophy, as a map. That evening, for the first time since this all began, he left the ranch after dark. Drove west, past the edge of the county, past the fields he'd grown up riding through, past the school where his niece had once played clarinet on the lawn, past everything that had been slowly swallowed by the same force now pressing against his own gates. He didn't go far, just far enough to stand on a ridge and look down at the complex of trailers, portable offices, and halogen lights, temporary, modular command centers arranged like a hive. This was their operation. Not theoretical, not legalistic. Physical. Present. He didn't step forward. He didn't confront anyone. He watched. He counted vehicles. He studied the names on the placards. Then he returned home. The next day, he called Mary again. "Can I file for public exposure?" She hesitated. "You mean a petition?" "No," he said. "I mean full disclosure, land encroachment, falsified survey data, nighttime invasion. I want it seen." Mary exhaled. "We can draft a summary. You'll need affidavits. You'll need other voices." "I'll get them," Lucas said. And he did. Over the next 72 hours, he made calls. Not to media, not to activists, but to ranchers, veterans, surveyors, and old neighbors who remembered the early fights over water rights and unmarked fences. One by one, statements began arriving. Not polished. Not legalistic. Just honest men saying what they saw, what they'd been told, and how the boundaries were being moved under their boots. The filing reached the county board 2 days later. 31 pages, maps, photos, correspondence logs, a copy of the unsigned buyout, a list of false names, a topographical overlay showing exactly where the intrusion had crossed from technical into criminal. And that was when it happened. The contractors disappeared. No formal withdrawal, no apology. Just a sudden vanishing. The flags came down. The phone calls stopped. The white truck never returned. Karen Shaw's license was suspended 3 weeks later for unrelated violations. Sterling Range Realty deleted its regional portfolio. The Ridge site shut down within the month. Lucas didn't celebrate. He replaced every gate, welded the hinges himself, repainted the fence line, dug a new trench just to feel the weight of earth in his hands again. One morning, Roy stood near the fence watching a hawk trace slow spirals above the pasture. Lucas stood beside him and didn't say a word. He didn't win a war. He just kept his land, and in this part of the world, that's all the victory a man needs. The land had gone quiet again. Not the brittle, ominous silence that had haunted the past few weeks, but something older, something familiar. The kind of stillness that settles over soil when it knows it's been defended, not for profit or principle, but out of sheer refusal to let it be taken. Lucas Rhodes didn't speak about what had happened, not because he was secretive, but because some things were better understood by the way a man stood in his own gate, or how he fixed a loose hinge without asking for help. The ranch returned to its rhythm, though it moved a little slower now, not out of weariness, but because Lucas had begun to consider time differently. For years, the days had passed like fence posts on a dirt road, measured by tasks, repairs, sun angles. But now there was space between the tasks, breath between the routines. He spent longer on the porch. He walked more without tools in his hands, not idle. Just more watchful. The kind of watchfulness that isn't about threat anymore, but memory. Roy still paced the pastures, slower now, his back stiffening in the early cold, his eyes a little more deliberate. Lucas talked to him sometimes, not out of habit or loneliness, but because Roy was the only one who'd seen it all, start to finish, and stayed. The burn barrel behind the barn was half full now, its bottom crusted in ash, the remains of letters, envelopes, flags, and other fragments of a war waged quietly and won with teeth gritted instead of drawn. He hadn't emptied it. Maybe he wouldn't. It stood there like a reminder, not of what was taken, but of what never got to be. One morning, a truck pulled into the far end of the road. An old neighbor, Tom Ridley, retired now, skin like cracked earth and lungs like a steam engine from too many years welding without masks. He got out slow, held up a thermos in greeting, and walked up to the porch without waiting for an invitation. They didn't talk about the fence, or the files, or the letters. They sat and drank and let the wind bring in the smell of dry oak and distant hay. Tom eventually said, "Heard they're pulling out of Parker County, too. Same crew, same tricks." Lucas nodded. "They'll keep circling," Tom added, "looking for weaker fences." Lucas didn't answer, just looked out toward the gate, where a new sign had been welded directly to the frame. No more plastic, no more screws. Just steel. It read, "No access, no offers, no exceptions." Weeks passed. Then months. One afternoon, a group of high schoolers came by. 3 of them, sweaty, shy, carrying clipboards and red faces. Agricultural program from the county school. Wanted to ask permission to document local land history. Lucas didn't scowl. He didn't bark. He stood there a minute, looked at them carefully, then said, "You bring real paper, not drones, and keep your boots clean. You can come up once." They came the next weekend. He showed them how the well pump worked, how the rotation of grazing was managed, how to tell when the soil was exhausted just by smell. When they left, one of them turned and said, "It's kind of wild someone tried to take this from you." Lucas had looked at him and replied, "They didn't try. They almost did." That stuck with him longer than he'd expected, not because it felt like trauma, but because it reminded him how thin the difference could be between a place that endures and a place that vanishes. The final envelope came on a Tuesday. Registered mail. This time it wasn't a threat, a buyout, or a complaint. It was from the county recorder. A single sentence beneath a formal header. All claims reviewed, parcel boundaries upheld, no pending actions remain. There was a seal at the bottom, embossed and official. Lucas placed it in the drawer beneath his ledger. Not in the safe, not in the trash, just where it belonged, with the records of births, deaths, and calves sold each season. As autumn settled over the land, Lucas began replacing the older sections of fence, not because they needed it, but because the work made sense to his hands. He rewound wire, Sanded old posts, repainted bolts with rust sealant, not to protect from invaders, just to remind the land it was still worth the effort. And every so often, as dusk bled into the ground and Roy stood silhouetted against the last light of day, Lucas would glance toward the road and feel no tension, no waiting, just the wind, just the dust, just the place doing what it had always done, standing quietly, because someone made sure it still could.